Texas is a land of ghosts. There's something about the endless highways, the tumbleweeds chasing after the horizon, and the heavy silence of the night that keeps the dead restless. But if you're talking about the most haunted place in Texas, there's only one that sends chills down every spine: Yorktown Memorial Hospital. I wasn't much of a believer in the paranormal. Ghost stories? Just campfire tales to keep kids in line. At least that's what I thought until I walked through the cracked doors of Yorktown Memorial. It started with a dare. My buddy Todd, always the thrill seeker, convinced me and his girlfriend Emma to check out the old hospital on Halloween night. "Come on," he said. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" Yorktown Memorial was abandoned in 1986, left to rot with its peeling paint and shattered windows. The stories about the place were legendary: phantom nuns stalking the halls, patients who never left, and the devil's eyes, a pair of glowing red orbs that supposedly appear when you've overstayed your welcome. "Bring a flashlight," Todd joked as we parked outside the decaying building. The air was thick with that sticky Texas humidity, the kind that clings to your skin like a second layer. Even the cicadas seemed quieter here, as if they too were holding their breath. The first thing that hit me was the smell: mold, rust, and something faintly metallic. The flashlight beams danced across graffiti-covered walls, each step kicking up clouds of dust. Emma clung to Todd's arm, her wide eyes darting at every creak and groan of the old building. We made our way to the main corridor, where the nurses' station still stood, barely intact. Todd flipped through a dusty logbook, laughing at the absurdity of names and dates long forgotten. Then Emma froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I hadn't, but her face was pale as milk. She pointed toward the staircase leading to the basement. "It sounded like footsteps." "Probably just rats," Todd said, but his voice had lost some of its usual bravado. He shined his flashlight toward the stairs. "Empty. See? Nothing." Still, Emma was uneasy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The basement was where they kept the morgue, according to the stories. Todd, of course, insisted we go down. "You can't explore Yorktown without seeing the morgue," he grinned, his flashlight already bouncing down the steps. The air grew colder as we descended, and the smell intensified. It was darker here, the kind of dark that seems to swallow light whole. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw a shadow dart across the wall. But shadows don't move like that, do they? Todd led the way, but even he seemed less eager as we reached the morgue. The room was small, with rusting gurneys and open drawers where bodies had once been stored. That's when we saw it. A handprint on the wall, fresh and smeared with something dark. "That's paint, right?" Emma's voice trembled. But it wasn't paint. The smell told us that much. And then we heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the far corner of the room. Todd swung his flashlight wildly, but it barely pierced the gloom. My heart raced as I grabbed Emma's arm and took a step back. That's when we saw the eyes. They were red, burning like embers in the darkness. They hovered just above the ground, unmoving, unblinking. It was like staring into the heart of something ancient and evil, something that didn't belong in this world. "Run!" Todd screamed, but the thing was already moving. It didn't walk. It crawled. Fast. Too fast. We bolted up the stairs, Emma sobbing, Todd cursing, and me trying to keep my legs from giving out. The growl grew louder, echoing through the halls, chasing us as we stumbled back to the main entrance. The doors wouldn't budge. We shoved and pulled, but it was like they were welded shut. Behind us, the growling stopped. The silence was worse. Todd turned his flashlight toward the hallway, and there it was, standing at the end. A shadowy figure, tall and gaunt, with those burning red eyes staring straight at us. It smiled. The doors burst open then, as if the building itself was spitting us out. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Todd floored it, gravel spraying as we sped away. None of us said a word. Todd never talked about that night again. He stopped joking about ghosts, stopped daring anyone to go to haunted places. Emma broke up with him a few weeks later, saying he'd changed. As for me, I moved to a different state, far away from Yorktown Memorial. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up sweating, my heart pounding in my chest. Because every now and then, I swear I see those red eyes watching me from the shadows. And I know it's still there, waiting for the next foolish soul to walk through those doors. In Denton, Texas, there's a bridge that locals only whisper about after dark. Old Alton Bridge, better known as Goatman's Bridge, is a relic of iron and wood that stretches over a murky creek. It's said to be haunted by a spirit so vile, so angry, that even the bravest ghost hunters leave trembling. The legend? A black goat farmer named Oscar Washburn was lynched here by a mob of angry townsfolk in the 1930s. They accused him of witchcraft, of summoning evil spirits to curse their livestock. They dragged him to the bridge, tied a noose around his neck, and threw him over the side. But when they looked down, his body was gone. What came back to haunt them wasn't human. It was a sticky, suffocating summer night when Jack, his girlfriend Lily, and their friend Ben decided to check out Goatman's Bridge. Jack had heard the stories, sure, but he didn't buy into that ghost nonsense. He was more worried about mosquitoes than spirits. "This place isn't scary," Jack said, leading the way with a flashlight that barely cut through the thick Texan night. "It's just an old bridge with some graffiti and broken boards. You believe in that Goatman crap?" Lily swatted at a mosquito on her arm. "It's not Goatman I'm scared of. It's the fact that we're in the middle of nowhere and no one knows we're here." Ben, the quiet one of the group, kept his head on a swivel. "People say they hear hoofbeats on the bridge," he muttered, "like something big and heavy walking behind them." "Spooky," Jack teased, stomping his boots loudly on the wooden planks. "Guess the Goatman's coming to get us," Lily groaned. "Can you not? This place already gives me the creeps." The bridge creaked under their weight, and the darkness beyond was almost alive, swallowing their laughter and replacing it with silence. Crickets chirped in the distance, but closer to the bridge, it was quiet. Too quiet. Halfway across, Ben froze. "Did you hear that?" Jack rolled his eyes. "What now? A twig snapping?" "No," Ben said, his voice low. "Listen." They all stopped. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that made it hard to breathe. And then they heard it, a low, guttural sound, like the bleating of a goat, but distorted, stretched, and wrong. It came from the woods on the far side of the bridge. "Probably just a coyote," Jack said, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. He scanned the tree line with his flashlight, but the beam couldn't penetrate the darkness. "Let's keep going." As they moved, the sound grew louder, closer. Lily clutched Jack's arm. "We should leave. Now." "Relax," Jack said, though his hands were shaking. "It's just an animal." Then the hoofbeats started. It sounded like something massive walking on two legs, each step resonating through the planks of the bridge. Jack spun around, his flashlight jerking wildly. Nothing. The hoofbeats stopped. "Who's there?" he called, trying to sound tough. Silence. He turned back to Lily and Ben. "See? Nothing." But Lily wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on something above his head. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't move." Jack froze. "What is it?" "Look up." Against his better judgment, Jack tilted his head. Hanging from one of the old iron beams was a noose, swaying gently in the non-existent breeze. And just beyond it, two glowing eyes stared down at him, eyes that burned like fire, set into a shadowy face with long, twisted horns. "Run!" Ben shouted, but the bridge was already alive beneath their feet, groaning and shaking as the hoofbeats returned, faster this time, pounding like a drumbeat. They bolted, their footsteps echoing in time with the monstrous strides behind them. Lily tripped, screaming as Jack pulled her to her feet. "Move!" he shouted, but it felt like the bridge stretched endlessly, the far side never getting closer. And then it spoke. The voice was deep and guttural, like rocks grinding together. "Why do you come here?" it boomed. "To mock me? To die?" Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he kept running, dragging Lily and Ben behind him. Finally, they reached the end of the bridge. They didn't stop running until they were back in Jack's truck, slamming the doors and locking them as if the creature might follow. The hoofbeats stopped as they peeled out, the old bridge disappearing in the rearview mirror. None of them ever spoke about that night again. Jack moved to another state. Ben deleted all his social media and vanished from everyone's lives. And Lily? Well, she still wakes up screaming, haunted by the image of those burning eyes and the voice that won't leave her mind. But every now and then, someone new ventures out to Goatman's Bridge. They think it's just a fun story, a place to test their courage. They don't realize the Goatman is waiting, watching from the shadows, his noose ready for the next fool who dares to cross his path. Yorktown, Texas, is a quiet town, the kind where time seems to stand still. But at the edge of town sits a crumbling relic of its past, the Yorktown Memorial Hospital. Once a place of healing, it's now a decaying monument to suffering and death. Its halls steeped in stories of hauntings so vivid they make your skin crawl. Locals say the hospital is alive, not with patients or doctors, but with something darker, something that feeds on fear. Jake, a struggling podcaster, decided Yorktown Memorial was the perfect subject for his next episode. He was tired of urban legends and ghost tours. He wanted something real, something that would put his name on the map. His friends, Tara and Chris, reluctantly agreed to join him. "People pay good money to see ghosts," Jake said as they parked outside the hospital, its facade cracked and overgrown with ivy. "This place? It's a gold mine." Tara adjusted the strap of her camera. "Or it's a tetanus shot waiting to happen." Chris, carrying a duffel bag full of equipment, glanced at the boarded-up windows. "You know people died here, right? Lots of people. Maybe we shouldn't mess with it." Jake ignored them, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed like a scream. Inside, the air was stale, thick with mildew and something faintly metallic. The flashlight beams danced across peeling paint, shattered glass, and graffiti scrawled in crimson paint. "Let's split up," Jake said. "We'll cover more ground that way." "Classic horror movie mistake," Tara muttered, but she followed his lead. Chris stayed close, muttering prayers under his breath. Jake headed to the basement where the morgue was located. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, their shadows stretching long and thin. His flashlight flickered. "Great," he muttered, smacking it against his hand. That's when he heard it, a whisper, soft, almost indistinguishable, like a breath against his ear. "Help me." He spun around, but the hall was empty. Just his imagination, he thought. He pressed record on his handheld mic. "If anyone's here, give me a sign." A clatter echoed from the end of the hall. He approached cautiously, his heartbeat loud in his ears. A gurney stood in the center of the room, its wheels squeaking as it slowly turned toward him. Jake swallowed hard. "Okay, you've got my attention." Tara explored the old operating rooms, her camera capturing the eerie stillness. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Jake, this place is seriously creepy," she said into her walkie-talkie. Static was her only reply. She moved to the nurse's station, flipping through abandoned files. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age. One caught her eye, a list of patients who'd died in the hospital. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "They never left." A loud crash made her jump. She spun around, her camera light landing on a shadow that darted out of view. "Chris? Jake?" Her voice trembled. The shadow moved again, closer this time. Tara backed away, but her foot caught on something, and she fell hard. When she looked up, a figure in a nurse's uniform loomed over her. Its face was pale, eyes sunken in black. It opened its mouth, and a guttural scream filled the room. Chris, in the chapel, felt an oppressive weight settle over him. The crucifix on the wall seemed to watch him, its painted eyes alive with malice. "I shouldn't have come here," he whispered, clutching a small rosary. A voice echoed through the chapel, low and mocking. "You shouldn't have come here." Chris froze. The crucifix turned on its nail, spinning upside down. The candles lining the altar flared to life, their flames unnatural and green. He stumbled backward, the rosary slipping from his hands. The pews began to move, scraping across the floor toward him as if pushed by invisible hands. "Leave me alone," he shouted, but the air itself seemed to close in around him, choking the words from his throat. Jake found Tara in the hallway, pale and shaking. "We need to go," she said, grabbing his arm. "What happened?" he asked. "I saw something. A nurse. She wasn't alive, Jake." Before he could respond, Chris burst into the hallway, his face streaked with tears. "This place is evil. We have to leave." The lights above them flickered, and the whispers began again, louder this time. "You can't leave." Doors slammed shut, one after the other, cutting off their escape. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the air. A shadow emerged at the end of the hall, growing larger with each step. It was the nurse, her hollow eyes fixed on them. Behind her, more figures appeared. Patients, doctors, all twisted and broken, their faces frozen in eternal agony. "Run!" Jake shouted, but the hallway stretched impossibly long. The walls closed in, the shadows reaching for them with clawed hands. They never made it out of the hospital. Weeks later, the local sheriff found their abandoned car, its doors hanging open. Inside Yorktown Memorial, the only trace of them was a camera lying on the floor near the nurse's station. The last recording? Jake's voice trembling, whispering, "If anyone's here, give me a sign." And then, a scream. There's a stretch of road just outside San Antonio, Texas, where even the bravest locals refuse to travel after dark. Known as the Devil's Road, it's officially just an unmarked back road off the main highway, winding through dense oak trees and past long abandoned buildings. But for those who dare to speak of it, the legends are chilling. It's said that those who drive this road at night risk encountering more than just eerie silence. People have vanished without a trace. Others speak of spectral figures in the trees, whispers that claw at the edges of sanity, and a shadowy figure known as the Watchman, a thing that doesn't let you leave. Mark and Amy were newlyweds passing through Texas on their honeymoon. They weren't ghost hunters or thrill seekers, just two people who'd taken a wrong turn while looking for a shortcut to their bed and breakfast. It was already past midnight when they spotted the narrow road cutting through the trees. "This has to lead somewhere," Mark said, gripping the wheel. Amy frowned, glancing at her phone's GPS. "It's not on the map." Mark shrugged. "Probably just a rural road. Let's give it a shot." As the car rolled onto the gravel, the forest seemed to swallow them. The headlights barely cut through the dense shadows. The trees loomed close, their twisted branches clawing at the night sky like skeletal hands. "Creepy," Amy muttered, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window. The first sign of trouble was the radio. Without warning, it crackled to life, the static cutting through the silence like a knife. Then came the whispers, faint and fragmented, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Mark fiddled with the dial, his brow furrowing. It's probably just interference. Amy didn't respond. She was staring at something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. "Stop!" she screamed. Mark slammed on the brakes and the car skidded to a halt just feet from the figure. It was a woman, dressed in tattered white, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her hair hung in clumps, and her eyes, they weren't right. They were black, bottomless, reflecting nothing but the darkness around them. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Mark called out, rolling down the window. The woman didn't move. Her mouth hung open, as though she were trying to speak, but no sound came. Then, slowly, she lifted a bony hand and pointed back the way they'd come. "We should go," Amy whispered, her voice shaking. Mark hesitated, but when the woman's expression twisted into something inhuman, her jaw stretching impossibly wide, he floored the gas. The car roared past her, but when Amy looked back, the road was empty. "She's gone," she whispered. Mark gripped the wheel tighter. "Just keep looking forward." The whispers grew louder. At first they sounded like the wind, but soon the voices became distinct. Men, women, children, all speaking at once, their words overlapping and impossible to understand. "Do you hear that?" Amy asked, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, but he didn't dare look at her. He kept his eyes on the road, which seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blurring together in the headlights. Then the car began to sputter. "No, no, no," Mark muttered, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. The engine died and the car rolled to a stop. The whispers stopped too, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the forest was holding its breath. Amy grabbed Mark's arm. "We can't stay here." "Don't get out," he said, his voice tight. "We'll call for help." She held up her phone, the screen glowing with a single word: no signal. "Great," he muttered. He reached for the flashlight in the glove compartment and stepped out into the night. The air was thick, suffocating, and carried the faint smell of decay. "I'll check the engine. Stay in the car," he said. Amy nodded, but didn't feel safer inside. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, and in the faint reflection of the glass, she thought she saw movement, a shape darting between the trees. Mark popped the hood, shining the flashlight on the engine. Everything looked fine, but the car wouldn't start. He slammed the hood shut and turned toward the driver's side when he saw them. Figures in the trees. At first they seemed like shadows, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized they were people, or at least they had been. Their faces were hollow, their eyes black pits. They stood unnaturally still, staring at him. "Get in the car!" Amy screamed, but he was frozen. One of the figures stepped forward, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Mark finally snapped out of it, diving into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. He twisted the key in the ignition. Nothing. "They're coming!" Amy cried, pointing at the windshield. The figures were walking toward the car now, their movements jerky, as if they were being controlled by unseen strings. "Start, damn it!" Mark yelled, pounding the dashboard. The whispers returned, louder now, reverberating inside their heads. Amy covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop!" The headlights flickered once, then went out. They were plunged into complete darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. When the sun rose the next morning, a passing driver found the couple's car parked neatly on the side of the road. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition. But Mark and Amy were gone. The police searched for weeks but found no trace of them. Their families plastered their photos on missing persons flyers, but no leads ever surfaced. Some say their spirits now haunt the Devil's Road, joining the shadowy figures that lure unsuspecting travelers into the trees. Others claim the road itself is alive, feeding on those who dare to tread its cursed path. And the locals, they just warn anyone passing through. If you see a woman in white, don't stop. And whatever you do, don't look back. The Yorktown Memorial Hospital sits off an old highway in Yorktown, Texas, a crumbling monument to a different era. Its brick facade is cracked, windows boarded up, and the stories tied to the place are darker than its shadowy halls. It's been abandoned since the 1980s, but the building doesn't sit empty. Not really. Locals call it cursed, haunted by the souls of those who died there. People swear they've seen glowing eyes staring out of the windows at night. Doors slam by themselves. Voices whisper names that no one living should know. The daring few who've entered tell stories of shadows that move when they shouldn't, of an overwhelming sense of being watched or hunted. But Ben and Chris didn't believe in any of that. The two best friends were road tripping across Texas, fueled by gas station snacks, energy drinks, and a shared love of urban legends. When they heard about Yorktown Memorial Hospital, Chris immediately added it to their itinerary. "Dude, it's supposed to be one of the most haunted places in Texas," Chris said, scrolling through his phone. "People hear screaming, see ghosts, like the whole deal." Ben laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, and they probably charge $20 to let you in and give you a real ghost experience." Chris grinned. "It's abandoned. No tours, just us and whatever's in there." "Sounds illegal," Ben said, but he was already intrigued. By the time they reached Yorktown, the sun was sinking behind the horizon, painting the sky a fiery red. The hospital loomed ahead like a forgotten tomb, its jagged silhouette casting long shadows over the overgrown yard. "This is it," Chris said, parking the car. He grabbed a flashlight from the back seat and handed one to Ben. Ready? Ben hesitated, staring at the building. It felt wrong, like the air around it was thicker, heavier. Let's make it quick. They climbed through a broken window, landing in what used to be the reception area. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, peeling paint, and old medical charts. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. Creepy, Chris whispered, his voice echoing in the emptiness. Ben shined his flashlight down a long hallway. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating doorways that led to patient rooms. Each door was open, blackness yawning inside like a hungry mouth. Why do all haunted places smell like death? Ben muttered, sticking close to Chris as they ventured deeper. The first sign of trouble was the laughter. It started soft, like the echo of children playing far away. Ben froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Did you hear that? Chris nodded, his face pale. Probably just wind. But it wasn't. The laughter grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from one of the rooms. Ben swallowed hard. This isn't funny, Chris. It's not me, Chris whispered. He took a step toward the room where the sound originated, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Don't, Ben hissed, but Chris was already peering inside. The room was empty, except for an old hospital bed with rusted wheels. The laughter stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Chris stumbled back, slamming into Ben. Okay, maybe we should leave, Chris stammered. Ben didn't argue. They turned back toward the reception area, but the hallway seemed longer now, the walls closing in. Their flashlights flickered, casting strange, twisting shadows. Then they saw her. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, her back to them. She was wearing what looked like an old nurse's uniform, but it was stained and torn. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her hair hung in matted clumps. "Excuse me," Chris called out, his voice cracking. "We didn't mean to trespass." "We're leaving." The figure didn't move. "Come on," Ben whispered, grabbing Chris's arm. They hurried past her, keeping their eyes on the floor. But as they passed, the temperature dropped, and Ben swore he heard her breathing, ragged and wet, like someone struggling for air. They made it back to the reception area, but the broken window they'd climbed through was gone. In its place was an unbroken wall. "Where's the window?" Ben gasped, panic rising in his chest. Chris shined his flashlight around the room. The walls seemed closer now, the shadows darker. "It was right here, I swear." A loud crash cut him off. It came from somewhere deep within the hospital, followed by footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. "We need to hide," Ben said, pulling Chris toward a door marked staff only. Inside was a small office, cluttered with old paperwork and a desk that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. They shut the door and pushed the desk in front of it, their breathing ragged. "This can't be happening," Chris whispered, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A shadow moved under the crack, and then came the knock. Slow, deliberate, and deafening in the silence. "Who's there?" Chris called, his voice shaking. No answer. The doorknob rattled, and the desk began to slide as something pushed against the door. Ben grabbed Chris's arm. "We have to run." The door burst open and the desk toppled over. Standing in the doorway was the nurse, her face now visible. Her eyes were black pits, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Blood dripped from her fingers. Ben and Chris bolted past her, sprinting down the hall. The laughter returned, echoing around them, joined by screams and whispers. The walls seemed to pulse, the building alive and angry. They found a staircase and ran up, not down. It was instinct, pure and desperate. On the second floor, they burst into a room and slammed the door behind them. It was a dead end. The windows were boarded up. The room was empty except for 2 hospital beds, their sheets stained and yellowed. Then they saw the writing on the wall, scrawled in what looked like blood. "You never leave." The door creaked open behind them, and then the screaming began. The next morning, a group of paranormal investigators arrived at the hospital. They found Ben and Chris's car parked outside, the doors unlocked and the keys still in the ignition. Inside, they found nothing but silence, and the words on the wall were gone. The Black Swan Inn sits just outside of San Antonio, Texas, on a piece of land soaked in blood and shadow. To locals, it's a relic of a darker time, a Civil War battlefield turned eerie mansion. It's the kind of place kids dare each other to visit, and adults pretend doesn't scare them. But the stories, oh, they never stop. They say the land remembers the screams of dying soldiers, that the walls of the Black Swan whisper secrets from the other side, that once you step inside, the house knows your fears and wears them like a second skin. And sometimes, just sometimes, it doesn't let you leave. Sarah and Kevin weren't ghost hunters. They weren't skeptics either. They were a young couple, bored and adventurous, looking for something to spice up their dull Texas road trip. When they heard about the Black Swan Inn from a waitress at a diner, Kevin's eyes lit up. Haunted Civil War battlefield, a creepy old mansion. Come on, Sarah. It's perfect. Sarah hesitated. You know these places always end up being tourist traps or just weird. Exactly, Kevin grinned. It'll make for a great story, and if it's lame, we can say we did it and move on. No harm, no foul. Against her better judgment, Sarah agreed. The Black Swan loomed at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The air was thick, humid, and still. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. This is way creepier than I expected, Sarah whispered as they stepped out of the car. Kevin laughed nervously, but his confidence had dimmed. The house was imposing, a sprawling Victorian structure with peeling paint, boarded-up windows, and a wraparound porch that sagged under its own weight. The front door creaked open before they even touched it. "Welcome," came a voice from inside. It was low and raspy, like leaves scraping across pavement. Sarah and Kevin exchanged uneasy glances but stepped inside. The interior smelled like damp wood and old paper. A woman stood in the foyer, her hair gray and wild, her eyes sharp and unsettling. "Miss Agnes," she said, extending a bony hand. "Caretaker of the Black Swan, you're just in time for the night tour." Kevin forced a smile. "Actually, we just wanted to look around. We heard about the place, and once you enter, the tour is part of the experience." Agnes interrupted, her grin too wide, too knowing. "The house insists." Sarah's stomach churned, but Kevin nodded. "Sure. Lead the way." The tour started innocently enough. Agnes recounted the bloody history of the land, the battles, the deaths, the whispers of witchcraft that had followed the family who built the inn. She led them through rooms filled with dusty furniture and cobwebbed mirrors. But as they moved deeper into the house, things started to change. The air grew colder, heavier. Shadows stretched longer than they should. Sarah noticed the mirrors didn't reflect them correctly. Her reflection seemed slower, her movements lagging behind. Kevin's flashlight flickered even though the batteries were fresh. "Something's wrong," Sarah whispered, grabbing Kevin's arm. "It's just ambiance," Kevin replied, but his voice wavered. Agnes stopped abruptly at a closed door. "This is where the tour ends," she said, her smile gone. "Go inside, if you dare." "What's in there?" Sarah asked, her pulse quickening. "The truth." Before they could respond, Agnes was gone, disappearing into the shadows. Kevin pushed the door open, and they stepped into what looked like an old dining room. A long table dominated the space, set with tarnished silverware and plates covered in dust. The chandelier above them swayed slightly, though there was no breeze, and then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like a distant conversation, but they grew louder, more insistent. Sarah spun around, trying to find the source, but the room was empty, except for them. "Do you hear that?" Kevin asked, his face pale. Sarah nodded. "Let's get out of here." But the door they'd entered through was gone. "Kevin." Sarah's voice broke as the whispers turned to laughter. Deep, guttural, mocking laughter that echoed off the walls. The chandelier's light dimmed, leaving them in near darkness. The shadows around the table began to shift and rise, taking on human forms. Soldiers in tattered uniforms, a woman in a blood-stained dress, a child clutching a broken doll. Their eyes glowed, hollow and hateful. "Welcome home," one of them rasped, its voice a mix of male and female tones. Kevin grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward where the door had been. But the floor beneath them warped, stretching into something soft and fleshy. It pulsed, warm and wet. The shadows moved closer. "Run!" Kevin screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The next morning, the Black Swan Inn looked as it always had, silent, imposing, and empty. Agnes stood on the porch, watching the sunrise with a faint smile. 2 cars sat abandoned in the driveway. Inside, in the dining room, the table was set for 2. The plates were no longer dusty, but clean and polished, with fresh food steaming on them. 2 figures sat at the table, frozen, pale, their faces twisted in eternal terror. Agnes hummed as she walked away. The house had claimed them, just as it always did. It wasn't haunted after all. It was hungry. Yorktown Memorial Hospital sits crumbling in the middle of nowhere, Texas, a monument to a time when medicine and faith collided in strange, unsettling ways. The building has been abandoned for decades, but the stories surrounding it are alive and well. They say the hospital is cursed, that the nuns who once ran it left something behind, something malevolent, and every now and then a foolhardy group decides to test their bravery by venturing inside. Tommy Jacobs wasn't the type to scare easily. He'd grown up in small-town Texas, surrounded by ghost stories and urban legends. But when his friends suggested breaking into Yorktown Memorial for a midnight exploration, he hesitated. "Come on, man," Mark goaded. "You're not scared of some old hospital, are you?" "It's not that," Tommy said. "I just don't see the point. It's all probably just mold and rats." Emily, their self-appointed ghost hunting expert, smirked. "You're chicken, admit it." Tommy rolled his eyes. "Fine, let's do it." The group, Tommy, Mark, Emily, and Sarah, piled into Mark's truck and drove the 40 miles to Yorktown. The closer they got, the quieter the truck became. By the time they pulled up to the hospital's overgrown parking lot, even Mark looked uneasy. The building was massive, its windows dark and shattered, its brick facade streaked with grime. A faded sign reading, "Yorktown Memorial Hospital, founded 1951, hung precariously over the entrance. "This place is a death trap," Sarah muttered, hugging herself. "That's the point," Emily said, adjusting the strap of her camera. "We're here to document the ghosts." Tommy sighed. "Let's just get this over with." The interior smelled like mildew and rot. The air was damp, thick, and carried an almost metallic tang. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint, rusted gurneys, and graffiti-covered walls. Emily started narrating for her camera. Yorktown Memorial Hospital was run by the Sisters of Mercy until the early 1980s. Over 500 people died here, patients and staff, and legend has it the nuns were, let's just say, less than merciful. Yeah, Mark said, waving his flashlight around. "Where's the scary stuff?" Sarah shushed him. "Do you hear that?" They all froze. At first, there was only silence. Then faintly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate. "Probably just an animal," Tommy whispered, though he didn't believe it. They followed the sound, their footsteps crunching over broken glass and debris. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness ahead swallowing their light. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice cracking. The only answer was a low, guttural moan. They found themselves in what had once been the surgical wing. Rusted medical equipment was scattered across the floor, and the walls were smeared with something dark that might have been rust, or might have been something else. Emily aimed her camera at an old operating table. "This is where they say the nuns performed alternative treatments, exorcisms, bloodletting. Rumor has it one patient went into a seizure and—" "Shut up," Tommy hissed. His flashlight beam had caught something in the corner of the room. A shadow, impossibly tall, standing perfectly still. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Mark turned, but by the time his light hit the corner, the shadow was gone. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But Emily was already moving toward the next room. "Come on, we haven't even seen the chapel yet." The chapel was the heart of the hospital and its darkest secret. The air grew colder as they approached, their breaths visible in the faint beams of their flashlights. The doors to the chapel were carved with ornate crosses, but the wood was splintered and the crosses had been scratched out. Emily pushed the doors open and they stepped inside. The pews were overturned, the altar smashed. Candles lined the walls, their wax melted into grotesque shapes. At the center of the room stood a massive crucifix, but the figure of Christ had been defaced, replaced by something else. A horned figure with hollow eyes and a grin that stretched too wide. "Nope," Tommy said, turning to leave, but the doors slammed shut behind them. The temperature plummeted. The candles along the walls flickered to life, casting dancing shadows across the room. "Who's there?" Emily demanded, her bravado finally cracking. Laughter echoed from the darkness, low, mocking, and layered, as if a dozen voices were speaking at once. The crucifix began to move. The horned figure's eyes glowed and its head tilted, as if watching them. Mark screamed, bolting for the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The laughter grew louder, more chaotic. Shadows stretched from the corners of the room, creeping toward them. "Help me!" Sarah shrieked as one of the shadows wrapped around her leg, dragging her toward the altar. Tommy grabbed her arm, pulling with all his strength, but the shadow was too strong. Sarah disappeared into the darkness, her screams cutting off abruptly. "Run!" Tommy shouted, dragging Emily and Mark toward a side door. They burst out of the hospital, gasping for air, their faces pale and their hands shaking. The truck was still there, thank God, and Tommy didn't hesitate. He shoved Mark into the driver's seat and screamed, "Go!" As they sped away, the hospital loomed in the rearview mirror. For a moment, Tommy thought he saw Sarah standing in one of the broken windows, her face blank and her eyes glowing. They never spoke of that night again. Emily burned the footage, swearing it was cursed. Mark moved out of state. Tommy stayed in Texas, but he avoided Yorktown like the plague. The hospital still stands, its walls whispering, its shadows waiting. Locals say they hear screams on quiet nights, and some claim to see a woman standing in the windows, but no one dares to go inside, not anymore. Mineral Wells, Texas, a town that feels like it's been forgotten by time, except for one thing, the Baker Hotel. Rising from the flat, dusty landscape, its crumbling facade looms like a skeleton of its former glory. Built in 1929, the Baker was once the pride of Texas, a luxury resort boasting mineral water baths that promised to heal body and soul. But now, it's just a shadow, filled with broken windows, peeling wallpaper, and stories. Lots of stories. They say the Baker is haunted, not just by one or two restless spirits, but by dozens, maybe hundreds. And while most locals steer clear, there are always a few who can't resist the lure of a good ghost story. For Molly and Jason, moving to Mineral Wells was supposed to be a fresh start. Jason had grown up in Dallas and thought a quieter life would help Molly's anxiety. She had been through a rough couple of years, losing her job, her dad passing away, the constant nightmares. Mineral Wells was small, cheap, and far from the chaos of the city. The Baker Hotel was just a quirky landmark, something to laugh about with their neighbors. Until Molly started hearing things. It began with whispers, faint and fleeting, like someone murmuring in the next room. She'd hear them in the kitchen while making coffee or in the bathroom late at night. Jason dismissed it as the old pipes in their rental house or Molly's overactive imagination, but Molly knew better. One day, she decided to walk to the Baker. It was only a few blocks away, and she told herself it would be a nice distraction. When she arrived, the sight of it made her stomach churn. The hotel was massive, its Art Deco design now cloaked in decay. Vines crawled up the sides and broken glass sparkled in the sunlight like jagged teeth. She stood there for what felt like forever, staring up at the dark windows. It felt like the building was watching her. "Molly?" She jumped. Jason was behind her, holding 2 grocery bags. "You okay?" "Yeah," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just curious about the place." Jason glanced at the Baker and shrugged. They say it's haunted, you know. Maybe that's why you're so drawn to it. That night, the whispers grew louder. Molly couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The voices seemed to be speaking directly to her now, though she couldn't make out the words. They were urgent, insistent, and then she heard something else, a laugh. Low and guttural, it echoed through the house. Molly shot up in bed, her heart pounding. "Jason," she whispered. He didn't respond. He was snoring softly beside her. The laugh came again, closer this time. It wasn't Jason. It wasn't human. Molly grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing nothing. But she felt it, the heavy weight of someone, something, standing just out of sight. The next morning, Molly convinced Jason to take a walk with her, back to the baker. "Why do you want to keep coming here?" Jason asked as they approached the hotel. "It's just an old building." "I don't know," Molly said, though that wasn't true. She felt called, drawn to the baker in a way she couldn't explain. They stood in front of the building, staring up at its towering walls. A faint breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound of humming. It was coming from inside. "Did you hear that?" Molly asked. Jason frowned. "Hear what?" The humming grew louder. Molly turned toward the broken front doors. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Molly, don't," Jason said, grabbing her arm. She shook him off. "I just want to look." Against every ounce of his better judgment, Jason followed her inside. The air was thick and stale, the kind of air that clung to your lungs. Dust motes swirled in the beams of sunlight that pierced through cracks in the walls. The lobby was eerily intact, as if the ghosts of old guests still roamed its halls. "It's just an old building," Jason repeated, though his voice lacked conviction. Molly ignored him. She was focused on the whispers. They were louder now, clearer. She could almost make out words. They were coming from the grand staircase. She climbed the steps slowly, each creak of the wood echoing through the empty space. Jason followed, swearing under his breath. At the top of the stairs, the whispers stopped, and the screaming began. It was deafening, a chorus of voices crying out in agony. Molly clapped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. Jason grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the stairs. "Let's go," he shouted. "Now." But Molly didn't move. She was staring at something. Someone. A woman in a tattered maid's uniform stood at the end of the hallway, her face pale, her eyes black as coal. "Molly!" Jason yelled. The maid raised a hand, pointing at Molly, and the screaming stopped. The silence was worse. "Get out," the maid whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Before it's too late." Jason managed to drag Molly out of the hotel. They didn't stop running until they were back at their house. That night, Molly didn't sleep. She sat in the living room, staring out the window at the Baker Hotel. The whispers had followed her home, and she knew, no matter how far they ran, no matter where they went, the Baker wouldn't let her go. It was waiting. Yorktown, Texas, a speck of a town where the ghosts of the past still linger. Nestled at the edge of a lonely highway stands the Yorktown Memorial Hospital. Built in the 1950s and abandoned decades ago, the hospital looks like a place that has forgotten what light feels like. The walls are cracked, the windows boarded, and the air carries a permanent chill, even in the blistering Texas summer. People say the hospital is haunted by those who died there, patients, nuns, and maybe worse things. It was the kind of place you stayed far away from unless you were stupid, curious, or both. For Sam and Emily, it was a little of both. Sam, a lanky guy with a camera practically glued to his hand, had convinced Emily to come along. She was skeptical, but intrigued, her love for ghost stories battling with her hatred of anything creepy. "It's just an old hospital," Sam had said as they parked the car in front of the building. "We'll film some B-roll, maybe catch a shadow or two and call it a night." Emily didn't respond. She was too busy staring at the hospital's front doors. They were slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. "People died in there," she muttered. "Lots of people. That's why it's perfect." Sam grinned. Come on, Em, think of the views. Real ghosts caught on camera. It'll go viral. Emily rolled her eyes but followed him. The gravel crunched under their feet as they approached the entrance. A strange smell hit them, a mix of mildew and something metallic. Blood? No, it couldn't be. That was just her imagination. Right. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating. Their flashlights barely cut through the darkness. The walls were covered in graffiti and broken glass crunched underfoot. Somewhere, water dripped steadily, the sound echoing like a heartbeat. This place is worse than I thought, Emily whispered. That's what makes it awesome, Sam replied, already filming. They walked down the main hallway, their footsteps eerily loud. The first room they entered had once been a patient ward. Rusted bed frames were scattered around, their mattresses long gone. Emily swore she felt eyes on her, but every time she turned, there was nothing, just shadows. Do you feel that? She asked. Feel what? Like we're not alone. Sam shrugged. That's the whole point. Relax. The further they went, the heavier the air became. Sam was filming everything, narrating like he was hosting a low-budget ghost hunting show. And here we are, folks, in the Yorktown Memorial Hospital. Rumor has it that the spirits of former patients roam these halls, seeking closure or revenge. Emily rolled her eyes again. You sound like a bad horror movie. Hey, if it works, it works. They entered what used to be the surgery room. The metal operating table was still there, rusted and stained. Emily's stomach turned. The whispers started soon after. At first they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the dripping water. But as they moved deeper into the hospital, the whispers grew louder. Words Emily couldn't understand. Voices layered on top of each other. Do you hear that? She asked, clutching Sam's arm. He nodded, his face pale. It's probably just the wind. But Emily knew better. The wind didn't sound like dozens of people murmuring in agony. They reached the basement stairs. The air was colder here, almost freezing. Emily hesitated. Sam, I don't think we should. Just a quick look, he interrupted. Then we're out of here. The basement was worse than the rest of the hospital. The smell of decay was overpowering. Their flashlights flickered as they descended, the batteries seemingly draining faster than they should. At the bottom of the stairs was the morgue. The steel drawers were still intact, though most of them were open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Sam aimed his camera at one of the drawers, narrating as he went. Legend has it that this morgue is the most haunted spot in the hospital. People have reported seeing faces in the drawers, hearing screams, even feeling hands grab them. A loud clang cut him off. Both of them froze. What was that? Emily whispered. Sam didn't answer. He swung his flashlight toward the sound. One of the drawers had slammed shut on its own. Okay, that's enough, Emily said, her voice shaking. Let's go. But Sam wasn't listening. He was fixated on the drawer. Slowly he reached out and pulled it open. It was empty. See? He said, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed him. Nothing to worry about. But Emily wasn't looking at the drawer. She was staring at the shadows behind him. They were moving. Sam, she whispered. We need to leave. Now. He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the room. The shadows recoiled, disappearing into the corners. But the whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. Emily grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the stairs. As they climbed, the hospital seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the whispers followed them. By the time they reached the main hallway, they were running. Almost there, Sam panted. But the front doors were no longer open. They were shut tight. Emily yanked on the handles, but they wouldn't budge. Sam! She screamed. Help me! He joined her, both of them pulling with all their strength. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through the hospital. And then, silence. Emily turned around slowly. The hallway was empty, but she could feel something watching them. Her flashlight flickered and died. Sam, she whispered, but he didn't respond. When she turned back, he was gone. Emily was found the next morning sitting on the front steps of the hospital, her face pale and her eyes vacant. She couldn't explain how she got out or what had happened to Sam. The only thing she remembered was a single phrase whispered into her ear before everything went black. "You shouldn't have come." Sam was never found. The footage on his camera, recovered days later, was nothing but static. But in the background, if you listened closely, you could hear the whispers. The Menger Hotel in San Antonio, Texas, is one of those places where history and the supernatural refuse to remain separate. It's been standing for over 150 years, its faded bricks soaked with the weight of its past. Once a grand luxury hotel, now it's just another destination for tourists, oblivious to the ghosts that walk its halls. Some of them never left. And that's the thing about ghosts. They can't leave because they've got unfinished business. But some of them aren't even aware they're dead. Nathan and Sarah were the kind of couple that loved the weird side of travel. Ghost tours, haunted locations, the kind of places you'd never visit on a family vacation. They weren't scared, or at least they didn't think they were. When they checked into the Menger on a warm Friday afternoon in late October, the lobby was alive with the usual bustle. Tourists snapping pictures, the clink of glasses from the bar, the hum of quiet conversation. Sarah took it all in, a little more cautious than Nathan, who was already cracking jokes to the hotel clerk as they checked in. "You sure it's haunted?" Nathan asked with a grin. "I need to know if I'm sharing a room with something that doesn't pay rent." The clerk just smiled, eyes too cold, his lips pressed in a way that said he knew more than he was willing to admit. "Oh, it's haunted," he said with a faraway look in his eyes. "But don't worry, most of the ghosts are friendly." Most of them. Sarah didn't like the sound of that, but she didn't want to spoil Nathan's fun. So she smiled and followed him up to their room on the second floor. As soon as they stepped into the room, Sarah felt it, an inexplicable heaviness in the air. The curtains hung still, untouched by even the slightest breeze, and the floorboards creaked underfoot in that way only old buildings can manage. Nathan flopped down onto the bed, kicking his shoes off and reaching for his phone. Sarah, on the other hand, was already eyeing the dark corner of the room where the shadow seemed a little too thick, even for the fading light of afternoon. "Hey, let's go check out the garden later," Nathan said, scrolling through his phone. "The place is supposed to be beautiful at night. They say some ghosts like to wander out there." Sarah didn't answer at first, too busy looking at the old portrait on the wall. It depicted a man, his face severe, eyes watching from the past like a heavy weight pressing down on her. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing at the painting. Nathan glanced up, squinting at the portrait. "I don't know. Maybe some rich guy who built this place. Probably some haunted millionaire. You know how it goes." But Sarah wasn't convinced. Something about the eyes, something about the way the figure seemed to be staring at her, not at Nathan, made her uneasy. She felt her heart race a little faster than it should. "Let's go down to the bar," Nathan said, already standing and heading for the door. "I need a drink." Reluctantly, Sarah followed him, trying to shake off the creeping feeling that something was just wrong. The bar was crowded when they arrived, a cozy, dimly lit room with a grand piano in the corner. The bartender, an older man with a weathered face and sharp eyes, nodded at them as they sat down. "What'll it be?" he asked, voice thick with age. "Something strong," Nathan said, grinning. "We're here to check out the haunted vibes, so we need to prepare for whatever's lurking." The bartender didn't smile back, but his eyes flickered briefly to the back corner of the room, a spot where the shadows seemed deeper than anywhere else. "Careful around here," he muttered under his breath. "Not everyone who walks through these doors leaves the same way they came in." Sarah felt a chill run up her spine, but Nathan just laughed, taking a sip of his drink as the bartender walked away. Later that night, after a few more drinks and far too much laughter to be healthy, they decided to take a walk through the hotel's garden. The night was warm, the stars twinkling high above, but the air still felt heavy. They wandered through the garden, the stone pathways winding around manicured bushes and fountains, feeling like something out of a forgotten dream. And then, in the distance, Sarah saw her, the woman in the white dress. She stood by one of the fountains, her back to them, her hair long and flowing like something from another time. Her dress was old-fashioned, as if she belonged to a different era altogether. She was eerily still, the kind of stillness that doesn't belong in the world of the living. "Hey, check this out," Nathan said, nudging Sarah. "We've got a live one." But Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was something wrong about the woman, something cold. Her body language was too rigid, too unnatural. And then, as if sensing their gaze, the woman turned around. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, like she hadn't seen the light of day in years, decades, maybe centuries. The ghostly woman's lips twisted into a small, knowing smile. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice like a far-off echo. "Leave before it's too late." Before Sarah could react, the woman disappeared, vanishing into the darkness without a sound. The only thing left was a faint, lingering scent of roses. The next morning, Nathan woke up to find Sarah sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale, her eyes wide. She was staring at the painting from the night before, the one with the man in it. "You okay?" Nathan asked groggily. Sarah didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, distant. "You remember the woman we saw last night?" Nathan frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, it was just some tourist dressed up for Halloween or whatever. You've got to stop spooking yourself out." But Sarah shook her head. She was no longer looking at him. She was staring at the portrait again. "I saw her. Again." Nathan froze. The air in the room suddenly felt colder. "She's in the painting," Sarah whispered. "She's in the painting, and she's watching us." Nathan turned, and for the first time, he really saw the portrait. The man in the painting was still there, but now next to him, standing just outside the frame, was the woman in the white dress. Her hollow eyes were staring straight at them. They left the Menger Hotel that day, though neither of them ever spoke about what happened after that night. But they both knew. They both felt it. The ghosts that walked the halls of that place didn't just stay in the past. Sometimes they followed you home.